The year was 1859, and the air in Independence, Missouri smelled of wet sawdust and unconfessed fear. It clung to the wooden planks of the general store and settled like a fine dust over the newly plowed fields. The small frontier town was the jumping-off point for the Oregon Trail, a place where dreams of golden land mixed with the hard reality of dust and distance. But the real unspoken line in Independence wasn't the trail west. It was the invisible humming boundary between a man's right to property and a man's right to freedom. Elias Thorne, a tall, silent farmer whose hands were permanently calloused from holding a plow, stood by the rail of the town's only bridge, watching the murky Missouri River flow with deceptive calm. He was an abolitionist, or as the locals sneeringly called him, an emigrant aid ruffian from Ohio, who had settled in this volatile borderlands not for gold, but for the principle of free soil. He farmed with his own two hands, refusing the labor that was the economic bedrock of the other side of the state line, in the slave state of Missouri. His antagonist, a man named Sterling Vance, owned the largest tobacco plantation on the outskirts of town. Vance was not present, but his presence, like the humid summer heat, was all-consuming. He felt it now, a cold dread brought on by a sudden, jarring sound, the sharp crack of a whip echoing from Vance's property, followed by a muffled cry. It was a sound everyone in Independence heard daily, yet pretended not to. Today, however, it seemed closer, louder, cutting through the usual drone of the blacksmith's hammer. Elias clenched his jaw, his knuckles white against the damp railing. This was the seed of discontent, not a grand political speech or a bloody skirmish, but the small, persistent cruelty that festered and demanded a response. He looked down at the river, wishing he could wash the sound from his memory. Suddenly, a commotion erupted 20 yards away near the entrance of the general merchant's store. A crowd had gathered, mostly farmers, travelers waiting for their caravans, and a few men who wore the hardened, suspicious look of local deputies. The center of the ruckus was a young man named Micah. Micah was known to Elias, a free black man who worked as an itinerant carpenter, building small, honest cabinets and mending fences. He was quiet, meticulous, and one of the few pieces of evidence in town that a black man could be anything other than a slave. Micah was backed against the wall, his carpenter's tool belt still fastened, his face slick with sweat and fear. Blocking his path was Deputy Silas Grantham, a man whose badge seemed less a symbol of law than an extension of local slave owner power. "I only need the salt, Deputy," Micah said, his voice barely a tremor. "I paid for it. Mr. Hemlock took the coin himself." Grantham, a broad man with a jaw set as tight as a rusty trap, spat tobacco juice onto the dirt near Micah's boot. "The law changed yesterday, boy. Sheriff got new orders from the Capitol." "What law?" a nervous merchant asked from the doorway. Grantham didn't bother to turn. "Any Negro, free or otherwise, must carry his papers at all times, detailing his full lineage and proof of purchase, signed by a magistrate, or facing carceration as a runaway. And I don't see no papers, Micah." Micah swallowed hard. "My papers are at my cabin. You know they are, Silas. You saw them when I registered last spring. It takes 2 days to ride to the magistrate and 2 days back. I just came for the salt." "Salt can wait," Grantham snarled. He reached out and grabbed Micah's arm with a jarring, brutal grip. "The law can't. Come on, boy. We'll verify you at the jailhouse. A night in the clink will teach you to carry your documentation proper." The air thickened, suffocating. The onlookers shifted, their boots scraping the dirt. No one spoke. This was the terrifying normalcy of the borderlands, the slow, systemic erosion of one man's liberty, justified by a new scrap of paper passed down from a distant white legislature. It was a minor event, a mere arrest for missing paperwork. But to Elias, standing rigid by the railing, it was a spark. It was the system, flexing its muscle, showing all present that even a free black man was, at heart, a piece of potential property that required white validation. Elias pushed off the railing, his worn leather boots crunching on the gravel. He knew that to intervene was to invite ruin, not just a beating, but the destruction of his farm, the threat of being branded an abolitionist agitator, a black Republican, or worse, a jayhawker, terms of escalating political and social violence. He had moved here to farm, to live by quiet principle, but the silence was now a form of complicity he could no longer bear. He walked into the clearing, drawing the gazes of everyone present. "Deputy," Elias said, his voice level, echoing the river's deceptively calm undertone. Grantham stopped dragging Micah and turned slowly, annoyance hardening into hostility. "Well, look what the wind blew in, Thorne. Mind your own business, dirt farmer. This is a matter of state law. The new law requires papers for free men. It says nothing about seizing tools," Elias stated, nodding toward the tool belt Grantham was now inadvertently tightening around Micah's waist. "That belt is his livelihood. A man has a right to his tools." The crowd watched the silent exchange. The historical tension of the American West was often framed by land, but here, on the Missouri border, it was framed by labor, whose hands worked and for whose profit. Grantham gave a short, humorless laugh. "You trying to lecture me on law, Thorne? You got 2 weeks of Missouri dust on your boots. You want to see the jailhouse, too? We're always looking for troublemakers to check for proper papers." Elias stepped closer, focusing his gaze only on Grantham's face. "I am simply reminding you that law is law, Deputy, even the new ones. If you seize his property without cause, the matter becomes complicated, and I have neighbors who will witness the complication." Elias did not have neighbors who would back him up. Most were pro-slavery, or at least indifferent to the fate of a black man. But the bluff worked. Grantham's eyes flickered to the faces in the crowd, men who, though they hated abolitionists, hated complicated paperwork and legal squabbles even more. They wanted stability, and a farmer demanding legal precision disrupted their rough order. Grantham's hand tightened. Then, with a curse, he shoved Micah hard against the wall. "Fine. Take your damn salt and go. Next time I see you without that paper, I won't stop at the jailhouse. I'll send you south with the first slave runner I find." Micah, breathing hard, stumbled to catch his balance. He didn't look at Grantham or the crowd. He looked at Elias, his eyes wide with a deep, silent gratitude that was too heavy to acknowledge with a word. He fumbled for his small sack of salt and fled, his boots silent on the dusty road. Elias stood his ground as Grantham turned, his face a mask of thwarted rage. "You made a mistake, Thorne. You interfere with the law, you interfere with property. And in this county, those are the same thing. People don't like meddlers. You're building a fire, and you're standing too close to the flame." Elias only nodded, the weight of the threat settling heavily in his chest. "We'll see, Deputy. We'll see what burns." He walked away from the merchant store, the silence of the crowd following him like a physical presence. The minor event was over. Micah was free, for now. But Elias knew he had just committed an act that would define his life in independence. He had drawn an invisible line in the dust, challenging the political foundation of the county. The confrontation with Grantham was not the Civil War. It was merely the first tiny crack in the dam. But the seed of discontent, once planted, was already beginning to sprout, sending its first fragile root deep into the hard soil of the American borderlands. Elias had moved to the frontier, seeking freedom for himself and others. Now he understood that freedom was not found in the vastness of the West, but had to be fought for, yard by yard, against the oppressive weight of a growing and hostile system. He was no longer just a farmer. He was now a declared man in a deeply divided territory.